Sorry, babe, work emergency. The voicemail clicked off, in the background clinking glasses and loud music. The third time he abandoned me at the courthouse. Beside me, a tall stranger crushed a land deed in his calloused hands. Judge Martha slid her glasses down her nose. Third time's the charm for both of you. Why don't you two just get hitched? We locked eyes. 10 seconds of absolute humiliated silence. Okay. 10 minutes later, I had a husband. Are you trying to make me look like a complete fool, Derek? The drive up to the Montana Valley was suffocatingly quiet. Wyatt didn't say much, keeping his eyes locked on the winding dirt road. The headlights cut through the dense pine trees, revealing nothing but shadows. When we finally pulled up to his horse ranch, the reality of what I had just done hit me like a physical blow. The place was beautiful, but in a rugged, desperate kind of way. Faded red paint peeling off the barn, fences leaning heavily under the weight of years, and a mountain of debt hanging over every inch of the soil. He carried my single suitcase inside, the floorboards groaning under his boots. The silence of the valley was absolute, a brutal, mocking contrast to the absolute chaos screaming inside my head. I was standing in a stranger's dimly lit living room, a stranger who was now my legal husband. He didn't marry me out of some romantic impulse. I knew that perfectly well. His grandfather was dying of severe heart failure in a hospital bed 2 towns over. The old man's final dying wish was to see Wyatt settle down before handing over the deed to the ranch. And our marriage was a transaction, a survival tactic for him to keep his family's land. And for me, it was a reckless escape from my own humiliation. But escape didn't change the cold, hard fact. I was carrying Derek's child, the child of the man who had just destroyed my entire world. Wyatt gave me the guest room. I lay down on the narrow, unfamiliar bed, staring up at the rotting wooden ceiling beams. The cold mountain air seeped through the window frame, but my body felt entirely numb. People who heard my story later would always ask the same judgmental question. Clara, you are a smart woman. Why would you let a man stand you up 3 times at the courthouse before finally waking up? They don't understand. They don't understand that destruction doesn't happen overnight. It creeps up on you, silently until you're drowning. It's exactly like the boiling frog syndrome. If you drop a frog in boiling water, it jumps out immediately. But if you put it in cold water and slowly, gently turn up the heat, it stays there until it's too late. That was me. That was Derek. The first year, he was flawless. He was the charming, ambitious man of my dreams, sweeping me off my feet. He made me feel like I was the absolute center of his universe. Then came the second year. The water started getting warm. The subtle excuses started pouring in. My business is struggling right now, Clara. My dad is sick. I have to fly back. I'm working these late hours for us, babe, for our future. Every single time he was late, every time he let me down, he'd follow it up with the most heart-wrenching, sweet apologies. He'd paint these brilliant, vivid pictures of the life we were going to build together, and I, like a fool, believed him. 3 times at the courthouse wasn't just blind stupidity. It was the devastating trap of the sunk cost fallacy. I had uprooted my entire life for that man. I left my hometown. I quit a brilliant landscape architecture job in the city. I drained every last cent of my life savings to help him fund his ruthless real estate ventures. To admit that he was a toxic, manipulative liar meant admitting that the last 3 years of my youth were a complete and utter joke. It meant looking in the mirror and admitting I had ruined my own life. So, I closed my eyes and chose to believe him. I wasn't waiting at that courthouse because I actually believed Derek would walk through those glass doors. I was waiting because I was absolutely terrified of starting over from nothing. I was terrified of facing the black void of my future. The cruelest thing a manipulator does isn't walking away. The cruelest part is how they slowly, meticulously wire your brain to believe that without them, you have absolutely no value. That every fight, every broken promise is somehow a result of your own lack of understanding. You're the most understanding, Clara. His voice echoed in my head, making my stomach violently churn. I curled into a tight ball on that unfamiliar bed, wrapping my arms protectively around my flat stomach. I was entirely alone, pregnant, married to a rugged stranger, and sleeping under a leaking roof in the middle of nowhere. The water was finally boiling, and I was burned alive. Derek used to buy me imported roses after a screaming match. He promised me a penthouse in the city while we stood in the middle of a shattered room. Wyatt didn't promise me anything. The first morning at the ranch, I woke up to the heavy thud of a hammer. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and walked out to the porch. Wyatt was up on the roof, fixing the leak right above my bed. He didn't smile. He didn't say a sweet good morning. He just climbed down, handed me a hot mug of black coffee, and walked toward the stables. His hands were rough, deeply scarred, covered in soil and grease. Derek's hands never had a single callus. Days bled into weeks, and something terrifying started happening to me. I started feeling suffocated, not by the mountain air, but by the absolute peace. I was constantly on edge. And every time Wyatt walked into the kitchen, my muscles tensed. I braced myself for the storm. I waited for the sudden yelling. I waited for him to slam a door, to tell me my pregnancy was a burden, to disappear into the night and come back with a pathetic, tear-eyed apology. But the storm never came. One evening, I dropped a glass. It shattered into 100 pieces across the wooden floor. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "I'm sorry." I flinched, bracing myself for the explosion. Wyatt just walked over with a broom. He didn't sigh, he didn't roll his eyes. "Step back, Clara, you're barefoot." His voice was entirely calm. I stared at him, my chest heaving. Why was I so anxious? Why was I secretly craving the chaos? I retreated to my room that night, my hands trembling. People always wonder why a smart woman stays with a toxic man for 3 long years. They think it's weakness, but it's not. It's a chemical addiction. When a man like Derek destroys your reality and then desperately glues it back together with intoxicating promises, your brain goes into overdrive. It's intermittent reinforcement. He pushes you to the absolute edge of despair, and then suddenly, he floods you with validation, a massive, dizzying hit of dopamine. You mistake that heart-pounding relief for passionate love. You become a gambler at a slot machine. You keep pulling the lever, taking the abuse, just praying for that one rare jackpot of affection. Wyatt didn't play games. He was a solid, unbreakable wall in a hurricane. And I was a junkie going through brutal withdrawal. Living with Wyatt made me realize how deeply I had been manipulated. I had to rewire my own shattered nervous system. I had to teach myself that true love isn't supposed to make your heart race in terror. It's supposed to make your heart slow down because you are finally safe. I walked back out to the kitchen. Wyatt had finished sweeping. He was sitting at the table quietly repairing a leather bridle under the dim yellow light. "I'm sorry," I whispered, stepping into the room. He paused, his rough fingers resting on the leather. He didn't look up, but his broad shoulders relaxed. "You never have to apologize for dropping a glass in this house, Clara." For the first time in 3 long years, I closed my eyes and took a full, deep breath. I thought the worst of my life was finally over. I thought this quiet ranch would be my sanctuary. I was so incredibly wrong. The real nightmare, the one that would test exactly how much we could survive, was already knocking at our door. Just when the dust started to settle, the ground caved in completely. It was a Tuesday morning when my phone rang. My supervisor's voice was shaking. "Clara, what did you do?" I drove straight to the site of the new Valley Conservation Project. My project. The one I poured my soul into for 2 long years. When I arrived, my blood ran cold. Heavy machinery was tearing through the protected wetlands. The ecological barriers were completely gone. Mud and debris were choking the local water supply. "Stop! Stop the machines!" I ran toward the foreman, waving my arms frantically. He just shoved a set of blueprints hard against my chest. "We're following your approved plans, lady." I stared at the paper. The signature at the bottom was mine, but the structural outlines were entirely altered. The protective zones were erased. No, this isn't my design. I rushed back to the architectural firm in town. I needed Shane. Shane was my senior partner, my mentor, the one person who reviewed my final drafts. When I burst into his office, he wouldn't even look me in the eye. He was hurriedly packing his belongings into a cardboard box. "Shane, someone swapped the files." He cut me off, his voice trembling but completely cold. "The authorities are already involved, Clara. You signed off on a cheaper, destructive layout to pocket the budget difference. The evidence is all in your drive." I stood there, completely paralyzed. Then I looked at the new, insanely expensive gold watch sitting on his desk. Derek. Derek had been buying up land adjacent to the wetlands. If my conservation project failed, the land value would plummet, and his real estate firm could sweep it all up for pennies. "He bought you. Derek bought you." Shane grabbed his box and walked right past me. "Grow up, Clara. Survival is expensive." By noon, my architectural license was suspended. By evening, federal environmental investigators were swarming my desk. I was facing massive fines and a federal prison sentence for environmental sabotage. The town turned on me instantly. In a small Montana community, land is sacred. I was suddenly the disgraced city outsider who poisoned their water. When I walked out of the local precinct after hours of grueling interrogation, a crowd had gathered on the sidewalk. They were shouting, holding up their phones, glaring at me with absolute disgust. I had never felt so entirely, utterly alone. My career was dead. I was pregnant, disgraced, and facing federal charges. I backed up against the cold brick wall of the precinct, struggling to breathe as the wind ripped through my thin shirt. Then a heavy black truck cut through the crowd, tires screeching against the asphalt. The door slammed shut. Wyatt walked right through the angry mob. He was still wearing his high-visibility mountain rescue jacket covered in dirt and pine needles from a long shift. In a town like this, the mountain rescue team are local heroes. The shouting died down the moment his heavy boots stepped onto the curb. He didn't look at them. He walked straight to me, took off his heavy jacket, and wrapped it tightly around my shivering shoulders. "She's coming home with me." A man in the crowd sneered. "She poisoned the creek, Wyatt. She's a criminal." Wyatt turned around. His eyes were like ice. "She is my wife, and I put my name, my ranch, and my badge on the line for her. If any of you have a problem with her, you bring it to my front door." Absolute silence. He put his warm hand on my lower back and guided me to the truck. He didn't ask me if I did it. He didn't demand a frantic explanation. When the truck doors closed, blocking out the hostile stares of the entire world, I finally broke down. "I didn't do it, Wyatt. I swear I didn't do it." He started the engine, his jaw tight. I know. He didn't hesitate. He didn't doubt me for a single second. The man I had loved for 3 years threw me to the wolves for a paycheck. The man I had known for a few weeks just stood between me and the entire town. But Derek wasn't done. Ruining my career was just his opening move. His real target was the ground we were driving back to. Derek wasn't just trying to destroy my reputation. He wanted the ground beneath my feet. His real estate firm needed Wyatt's ranch to complete his development block. If Wyatt went bankrupt, the land would go to a public auction and Derek would swallow it whole. It was 2 a.m. when the smell of ash woke me. I sat up, coughing as a thick gray haze filled my bedroom. Through the window, the night sky wasn't black. It was glowing a furious, violent orange. "Wyatt!" I ran down the stairs, my bare feet slipping on the wooden floor. The front door was wide open. Outside, the heat hit me like a physical wall. The main stables were completely engulfed in flames. I could hear the agonizing, high-pitched screams of the trapped horses. Wyatt was already out there, his shirt soaked in sweat and soot, desperately swinging a heavy metal crowbar against the jammed stable doors. The wooden beams above him were groaning, ready to collapse at any second. "Wyatt, get back!" He didn't listen. He kept swinging. He was losing everything his grandfather had built, right in front of his eyes. Suddenly, the piercing wail of sirens ripped through the valley. A police cruiser tore up the dirt driveway, kicking up gravel. Sheriff Miller stepped out, but he didn't run toward the water hoses. He marched straight toward Wyatt, his hand resting heavily on his holster. "Step away from the barn, Wyatt." Wyatt turned around, wiping soot from his eyes, his breathing heavy. "What are you doing? Help me get the horses out." I said, "Back away." "We got an anonymous tip, Wyatt. Someone said you were buying gasoline in bulk this afternoon. Said you've been talking about insurance payouts." My heart stopped. The air vanished from my lungs. Insurance fraud. Derek. Derek had paid off Shane. Of course he could pay off a local deputy or call in a fake tip. If Wyatt was arrested for arson, the bank would seize the property immediately. Derek would win. "You're out of your mind, Miller. The roof is caving in." Wyatt shoved past the sheriff, but two deputies grabbed his arms, pinning him against the hood of the cruiser. "Let him go. He's trying to save his animals." I screamed, running toward them, but a deputy blocked my path. "Ma'am, stay back. We have evidence he's trying to burn it down for the cash. The cash." And the only thing that could prove Wyatt wasn't after insurance money was the stack of rejection letters from the insurance companies and the recent, legally approved bank loan documents he had signed yesterday. I had seen them. I had read them. They were in the small wooden office, inside the burning barn. If those papers burned, Wyatt had no defense. It would be his word against a rigged system. I looked at Wyatt, pinned against the car, his eyes filled with absolute despair as he watched his legacy burn. He was the only person who had stood up for me when the entire world called me a criminal. I wasn't going to let him lose everything. I turned around and ran straight toward the roaring flames. "Clara?" "No!" Wyatt's voice cracked, a raw, terrifying sound of pure panic. I didn't stop. And I threw my arms over my face and plunged into the thick, black smoke. The heat was blinding. It felt like my skin was melting off my bones. Embers rained down on my hair and shoulders. I ran past the first few stalls, violently pulling the heavy iron latches down. "Go! Get out!" The terrified horses bolted past me into the cold night air. I kept pushing forward, coughing violently as the smoke filled my lungs. The wooden door to the small office was already catching fire. I kicked it open. The room was a furnace. I grabbed the heavy metal lockbox from the desk. The metal seared the palms of my hands, but I didn't let go. I clutched it against my chest, turning back toward the exit. Suddenly, a massive burning beam snapped above me. It crashed to the dirt floor, completely blocking the doorway. The flames instantly crawled up the walls, entrapping me inside. The smoke was too thick. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't see anything. "Wyatt!" I sank to my knees, clutching the metal box tightly against my stomach. The air was entirely gone. The edges of my vision started turning black. I closed my eyes, listening to the deafening roar of the fire, waiting for the end. I don't remember him breaking through the burning door. I don't remember being carried out of the flames. All I remember is the sensation of freezing mountain air violently hitting my scorched skin, and a voice screaming my name so loud it tore through the roar of the fire. Then, absolute suffocating darkness. I woke up to the steady rhythmic beep of a hospital monitor. The smell of ash and melted plastic was still buried deep in my lungs. My throat felt like it was lined with shattered glass. And I tried to shift my weight, but a heavy, dull ache anchored me to the sterile mattress. A doctor was standing at the foot of my bed. She had that specific, tight-lipped expression medical professionals wear when the news is going to break you. "Clara, you suffered severe smoke inhalation and extreme physical exhaustion." She paused, her eyes dropping slowly to my stomach. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavier than the fire. "I'm so sorry. Your body went through too much trauma. You lost the baby." The machine kept beeping, steady, indifferent. The world didn't stop turning, but mine just vanished entirely. I turned my head toward the window, staring blankly at the gray morning light. I expected to feel pure, unadulterated devastation, and the physical pain tearing through my abdomen was unbearable. But beneath that searing ache in my chest, there was something else, something I was terrified to admit, a cruel, brutal sense of release. That unborn child was the very last thread connecting me to the darkest 3 years of my life. It was the final lingering drop of Derek's poison in my veins. The fire had taken it. The fire had burned it all away. I was completely empty. But for the first time in years, I was entirely mine again. A single tear slid down my cheek, hot and bitter against my soot-stained skin. I wasn't just crying for the tiny life that was lost in the smoke. I was crying for the woman who had to die in that burning barn so I could finally be free. A heavy, sudden movement beside my bed pulled me back. Wyatt was there. He wasn't sitting in the plastic visitor's chair. He was on his knees on the cold linoleum floor. What the stoic, unbreakable mountain man looked completely shattered. His clothes were still covered in black soot and dirt. His hands, wrapped in thick white bandages from the flames, were trembling violently as he gripped the metal rail of my bed. "Clara, I am so sorry." His voice was a raw, broken rasp. He buried his face against the edge of my mattress, his broad shoulders shaking uncontrollably. "I dragged you into this hell. You went back in there for my ranch, for my mess. You lost your baby because of me." He was drowning. He thought the fire, the setup, the miscarriage. He thought it was all his fault. He was taking the weight of my tragedy and burying himself under it. I slowly reached out. My fingers were bruised and shaking as I gently touched his ash-covered hair. "Wyatt, look at me." He didn't move at first. Then slowly, he raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with an agony so deep it perfectly mirrored my own. "You didn't do this to me. You are the only person who actually tried to save me." We just stared at each other in that sterile, quiet room. The heavy, invisible walls we had built around ourselves were completely gone. The awkward boundaries of our fake, desperate marriage had burned to ashes in that barn. What was left in its place was a bond forged in pure, devastating loss. I slid my hand down to his rough, unshaven cheek. He leaned into my palm, closing his eyes, letting out a long, shaky breath that sounded like a sob. We were two broken souls sitting at the absolute bottom of the abyss. But as his bandaged hand wrapped gently around my trembling fingers, I knew we weren't going to stay in the dark. When we were going to crawl out together. I was discharged from the hospital 3 days later. The drive back to the ranch was completely silent. When Wyatt parked the truck, I just sat there staring out the window. The ruins of the main stables were still smoldering. The heavy, suffocating scent of wet ash hung in the cold mountain air. We had no money. We had no barn. We had a mountain of debt that was ready to bury us alive. That night, we didn't collapse. We didn't cry in each other's arms, whispering empty, romantic promises that everything would magically be okay. Instead, we sat across from each other at the scarred wooden kitchen table. A single yellow bulb flickered above us. Between us was a stack of unpaid bills, foreclosure warnings, and a terrifyingly blank legal pad. Looking at Wyatt's exhausted, soot-stained face, and I realized a brutal, undeniable truth about marriage. When you're young, you dream about a wedding filled with imported roses, passionate vows, and fiery romance. But at 29, standing in the ashes of my career and his legacy, Wyatt and I understood exactly what this was. Marriage, in its rawest and most unbreakable form, is a survival contract. It is a high-risk partnership where two people have to surrender their most valuable asset, absolute blind trust. We weren't staring deeply into each other's eyes. We were staring at loan applications. We divided the debt line by line. We assigned extra work shifts. We counted every single copper penny. Our love didn't bloom from some cinematic kiss in the pouring rain. It grew from those sleepless nights, sitting shoulder to shoulder, calculating the exact cost of rebuilding our lives from the ground up. It turns out, the absolute most romantic thing a human being can say isn't, "I love you." It's, "I will carry half of this debt with you." Before he was ever an incredible lover, Wyatt was my teammate. He was the most reliable business partner the universe could have thrown at me during a Category 5 hurricane. He pushed a piece of paper across the table. It was a new commercial loan agreement. He had put the remaining unburned acres of the valley up for collateral. He signed his name, his handwriting sharp and deliberate. Then he slid the pen to me. I didn't hesitate. I picked up the pen and signed my name right next to his. Wyatt watched me, his dark eyes softening in the dim light. He reached into the pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He untied the rawhide string and slid something heavy across the table. It was a ring, a massive, breathtaking piece of rough turquoise, set in heavy, tarnished silver. It belonged to my grandmother, and my mother after her. It's the family turquoise. I stared at the blue stone. It wasn't a pristine, flawless diamond. It was rugged. It had deep veins and imperfections. It looked exactly like the harsh Montana land we were trying to save. "I know this didn't start the right way, Clara, but I want you to have it, if you want it." My throat tightened so hard it ached. I didn't say a word. I just held out my left hand, my fingers still bruised from the fire. Wyatt took the ring, his rough, calloused fingers trembling slightly as he gently slid the cold silver onto my finger. It fit perfectly. "Wow, we are going to rebuild this place, Wyatt." He looked down at our joined hands, his thumb brushing slowly against the turquoise stone. "Yeah, we are." For the first time since I stepped foot in this valley, I felt entirely grounded. We were two scarred warriors standing in the rubble, ready to fight the entire world back to back. We thought the hardest part was over. We thought the fire was the absolute worst thing Derek could do to us. We had no idea that the real storm, it wasn't coming from the fire. It was going to be pulled right out of the freezing snow. 4 months later, the brutal Montana winter hit the valley. The kind of blizzard that buries houses and freezes the roads solid. Wyatt was on a grueling 48-hour shift with the mountain rescue team. I was at the ranch, keeping the wood stove burning. I listening to the wind scream against the frosted windows. Suddenly, the heavy front door flew open. Wyatt stood in the doorway, completely covered in snow, panting heavily. But he wasn't alone. Wrapped tightly inside his thick, high-visibility rescue jacket was a tiny, shivering bundle. I found a crashed truck off the interstate. The driver was gone, Clara. He just left him there. Wyatt stepped into the light, and I finally saw him. A little boy, maybe 4 years old. His lips were blue, his huge brown eyes wide with absolute silent terror. He was clinging to Wyatt's jacket like it was the only solid thing left in the entire universe. Something inside my chest violently snapped. After the fire, after waking up in that sterile hospital room and realizing my baby was gone, I was so sure that the part of me meant to be a mother had burned to ashes. I thought my heart was a completely barren wasteland. I thought I had absolutely nothing left to give. But looking at this freezing, abandoned child, that dead, empty space inside me roared back to life with a fierce, blinding intensity. I rushed forward, grabbing a thick woolen blanket from the couch. "I got you, sweetheart, I got you." I wrapped him up, pulling his tiny, freezing body tightly against my chest. He didn't cry. He just buried his cold face into my neck, his little hands desperately gripping my shirt. I looked over his head at Wyatt. We didn't need to say a single word. The fierce, protective look in his dark eyes matched mine perfectly. We were not letting this boy get lost in the foster system. His name was Cody. Well, the next few months were a grueling, exhausting war with state child services. We were a couple with a massive pile of commercial debt, a half-burned ranch, and a marriage license that was barely a year old. On paper, we were a massive liability. The social workers looked at us with deep, calculating suspicion. They saw a reckless, unstable couple. But Wyatt and I fought like absolute hell. We sat through endless, invasive interviews. We submitted to rigorous background checks and psychological evaluations. We didn't sleep. We worked double shifts to prove we had a stable income plan. We rebuilt the main stables with our own bare hands to prove we could provide a safe home. We fought the state with the exact same desperate, stubborn grit we used to fight the fire. We proved that this child was already our son in every single way that mattered. When the family court judge finally slammed the gavel and finalized the adoption, I cried so hard I couldn't catch my breath. Wyatt wrapped his arms around both of us right there in the courtroom, burying his face in Cody's hair. By spring, the ranch was completely transformed. It wasn't just the fresh pine wood of the new stables or the new rescue horses grazing in the green pasture. It was the sound. The heavy, suffocating silence of the valley was entirely gone. It was replaced by the bright, ringing sound of Cody's laughter echoing across the dirt driveway. He would run after Wyatt everywhere, wearing a tiny, battered cowboy hat that was way too big for him, trying his hardest to mimic Wyatt's long, confident strides. I would stand on the porch, holding a warm mug of coffee, just watching the two of them. Wyatt would scoop Cody up, throwing him over his broad shoulder, both of them laughing loudly under the clear, endless blue Montana sky. My chest would swell with a happiness so profound, so incredibly heavy, it actually physically hurt. We had survived the absolute worst. We had survived the betrayal, the crushing debts, the flames that nearly took our lives. We had built a real, unbreakable family out of the bitter ashes of our pasts. The storm was finally over. We had finally won our happy ending. At least, that is the comfortable lie we told ourselves, because we were completely oblivious to the shadow creeping up our driveway. For a few months, I actually let myself believe we were safe. We were sitting on the porch. The sun was setting, casting this warm, golden light over the valley. Cody was chasing a stray barn cat in the yard, giggling so hard he kept tripping over his oversized boots. Wyatt was leaning against the railing, watching him, a rare, genuine smile on his face. Everything felt absolutely perfect. Then the sound of a heavy engine tore through the quiet. A sleek, expensive black SUV rolled up our dirt driveway. It didn't belong in our world. The door opened and a man stepped out, his polished shoes instantly sinking into the mud. He looked familiar, way too familiar. He had the exact same arrogant, sharp jawline as Derek. It was Vance, Derek's half-brother, a guy known around the entire county for unpaid gambling debts and incredibly dirty deals. He walked up the porch steps, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered on his face. Wyatt instantly stepped in front of me, in his hand instinctively gripping the porch rail. "Get off my property, Vance." Vance just chuckled, pulling a thick manila envelope from his tailored jacket. "I am not here for a social call, cowboy. I am just the messenger." He tossed the envelope onto the small wooden table. It slid toward me. My hands started to shake. I picked it up and pulled out the crisp official papers. The words blurred together at first, but then they hit me like a physical blow. Subpoena. Revocation of adoption. The Montgomery Mining Corporation. What is this? Vance leaned against the wooden post, crossing his arms. Turns out, your little rescue project is not just some abandoned stray. His biological parents have been looking for him, and they want him back. I dropped the papers and pulled Cody behind my legs, my heart slamming violently against my ribs. We legally adopted him. The state signed off." Vance interrupted me, his voice dripping with condescension. "The Montgomerys are billionaires, Clara. They own half the mines in the next state. You really think a piece of paper from a local judge is going to stop them from taking their flesh and blood?" Wyatt grabbed Vance by the collar of his expensive jacket, shoving him hard against the wooden pillar. "If they want him, why send a rat like you?" Vance gasped for air, but that disgusting smirk did not leave his face. "Because they hired me to find him, and I have not officially sent them the address yet. I figure you two owe me a finder's fee, say $500,000. You pay up, I tell the Montgomerys the trail went cold. You don't, and their lawyers will tear this pathetic little ranch apart and take the kid by Friday. Then he shoved Wyatt's hands off and straightened his collar. You have 3 days to decide if playing house is worth losing everything. He turned and walked back to his SUV. The engine roared to life, leaving a thick cloud of dust in the driveway. I dropped to my knees, pulling Cody into my chest, wrapping my arms around him so tightly he let out a small gasp. "Mommy, why are you crying?" I couldn't speak. I looked up at Wyatt. His face was completely pale, his fists clenched so hard his knuckles were white. We had fought the fire, we had fought the crushing debt, we had fought the entire town. But how could we possibly fight a billionaire empire that had biology on their side? They were coming for our son. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat in the rocking chair by Cody's bed, listening to his soft, even breathing. And they had billions of dollars. They had an army of ruthless corporate lawyers. But I had something they didn't. I had the absolute terrifying desperation of a mother defending her child. I wasn't going to just sit in this farmhouse and wait to be slaughtered. Harper came over before the sun was even up. She locked the diner, drove through the morning frost, and slammed a heavy laptop onto my kitchen table. We didn't have the money for a fancy private investigator, so we became our own. For 3 brutal days, we dug through the dark corners of the internet. We pulled every public tax filing, every obscure shell corporation, every forgotten news article tied to the Montgomery mining empire. We drank stale coffee until our hands shook, chasing down a ghost. Then, Harper found it. "Clara, look at this." She turned the screen toward me. It was a buried federal notice from 3 years ago. The Montgomerys weren't just a wealthy, reclusive family living abroad. They were fugitives. They were facing a massive, multi-million-dollar federal warrant from the EPA. They had been caught illegally dumping highly toxic chemical waste into a local river system to cut costs. They didn't tragically lose their son in a chaotic moment. They intentionally abandoned Cody to flee the country and dodge a federal prison indictment. I stared at the screen, my blood turning to ice. Why now? The statute of limitations on the EPA charges hasn't expired. Coming back to the U.S. means risking federal prison. So why risk it all for a son they threw away 3 years ago? Harper's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing firewalls and digging into county land registries. Because of this, Clara. Then she pulled up a highly classified geological survey map of our valley. It was filed by a proxy company just 6 months ago, the exact same proxy company Vance worked for. I leaned in, tracing the bright red and yellow lines on the map with my trembling finger. The lines converged right here, right under our feet. Underneath Wyatt's ranch was one of the largest, completely untapped rare earth mineral veins in the entire state of Montana. But there was a catch, an old, forgotten homestead law. The deep mineral rights didn't belong to the surface owner. They belonged to the original descendants of the valley's first settlers. I looked at the names on the old scanned deed. My breath caught violently in my throat. The names belonged to Cody's biological grandparents. My little boy was the sole legal heir to a billion-dollar gold mine. And it all made sickening, horrifying sense. Derek trying to burn down our barn and bankrupt Wyatt was just the clumsy first step. But Vance was smarter. Vance found the geological survey. He realized Wyatt's adopted kid was the heir to the fortune beneath the dirt. He sold the information to the Montgomerys for a massive cut. If those billionaires got custody of Cody, they would get legal, absolute control of his inheritance until he was 18. They would strip mine Wyatt's ranch, pay off their federal EPA fines with the profits, and pocket the rest. I pushed the chair back and stood up. My knees were shaking, but not from fear. This was never about a grieving mother missing her child. This was never about the sacred bond of blood. It was about pure, unadulterated, bottomless capitalist greed. They looked at my little boy, ours with his oversized cowboy hat and his bright, innocent laugh, and all they saw was a drill site. All they saw was a get-out-of-jail-free card. I walked over to the printer, listening to the pages of the EPA warrants and the geological maps slide out one by one. My hands weren't shaking anymore. The paralyzing, suffocating fear of the last few days was entirely gone. It was replaced by a cold, violent fury. They thought they could stroll into our valley, buy the local judges, and rip my son out of my arms to save their own skin. They thought because we wore muddy boots and had a mortgage, we would just roll over and surrender. I stacked the papers together, gripping the edges so hard the paper crumpled. You want to take my son? And you want to tear up my husband's land to do it? I looked out the window at the morning sun hitting the mountains. We will see about that. The courtroom was suffocatingly hot. The Montgomerys sat across the aisle surrounded by a wall of men in $1,000 suits. Mrs. Montgomery was dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. They looked like royalty. We looked like two exhausted, dirt-stained ranchers who had barely slept in a week. Their lead attorney stood up, buttoning his jacket with a smug, arrogant smile. Your Honor, this is a simple matter of biology and rightful inheritance. The Montgomerys are the biological parents of this child. They have the financial means to provide him with a life of absolute privilege. These foster parents are currently drowning in commercial debt. They cannot offer him the future he deserves by blood. He looked at us like we were dirt under his expensive leather shoes. I didn't wait for our court-appointed lawyer to speak. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but my voice was completely steady. Your Honor, they don't want a son. They want a human shield. Objection! The lawyer shouted, but I was already walking toward the judge's bench. I slammed the thick stack of printed documents right in the center of the polished wood. Those are classified federal warrants from the EPA. The Montgomerys didn't tragically lose their child in a storm. They abandoned him in a freezing truck 3 years ago so they could flee the country and dodge a federal prison sentence for illegal toxic dumping. The entire courtroom erupted into frantic, chaotic whispers. Mr. Montgomery's face turned completely pale. His lawyer scrambled to grab the papers, but I slapped my hand down on them. And that is a geological survey map of the valley. I turned to face the Montgomerys. My blood was boiling, roaring in my ears. You didn't come back because you missed your little boy. You came back because the statute of limitations is running out, and you found out your abandoned son is the sole legal heir to a billion-dollar mineral vein under my husband's ranch. You need his custody to strip mine the land and pay off your federal fines. The silence that followed was absolute, deafening. Mrs. Montgomery dropped her silk handkerchief. The judge stared at the federal warrants, his jaw tight. Their lawyer stammered, trying to regain control. Your Honor, regardless of these baseless allegations, DNA is undeniable. They are his blood. They are his family. I turned back to the judge. Tears were burning my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. This was the battle for my son's life. We idolize biology so much in this society. We think DNA gives you absolute ownership over a human soul. But parent is a verb, Your Honor. It is not a biological status. I looked at Wyatt, who was watching me with tears in his own eyes, his scarred hands clenched tightly in his lap. DNA creates a physical link. But waking up at 3 a.m. to soothe a terrified, crying child, holding his tiny hand through a nightmare, walking into a blazing fire and fighting billionaires to keep him safe, that is what makes you a family. I pointed a trembling finger at the Montgomerys. They share his DNA, but they look at him like a misplaced piece of property, all like a get-out-of-jail-free card. My husband and I don't share a single drop of blood with Cody, but we would tear the world apart to keep him safe. Blood can give you a lineage, but only selfless, unconditional sacrifice can give you a home. The judge looked from me to the trembling Montgomerys and finally down to the stack of undeniable evidence. He slammed his gavel down. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Custody remains with Clara and Wyatt. And bailiff, please contact the federal marshals. I believe the EPA has a standing warrant for the Montgomerys in this courtroom. It was over. Wyatt grabbed me, pulling me into a crushing, desperate hug. He buried his face in my shoulder, his chest heaving with silent, overwhelming relief. The billionaire empire crumbled right there in the courthouse, defeated by a piece of paper and a mother's absolute refusal to back down. We walked out through the heavy wooden doors. The mountain air had never felt so incredibly clean. 3 years later, the Montana spring finally broke through the valley. The scent of wet ash was completely gone. In its place, the pastures were a brilliant, blinding green, rolling all the way up to the base of the mountains. I stood in front of the farmhouse mirror, smoothing down the simple white lace of my dress. No imported roses this time, no massive guest list, no frantic last-minute phone calls praying for a man to show up. Just wildflowers we picked from the fields this morning, and the quiet, steady rhythm of my own heart. When I walked out onto the wooden porch, the late afternoon sun was turning the valley to gold. Wyatt was waiting for me at the end of the dirt path. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo, just a clean white shirt, his favorite denim jacket, and a smile that reached all the way to his dark, quiet eyes. Beside him was Cody. He was 7 now, missing his 2 front teeth, holding a small wooden box with his little hands shaking from pure excitement. "Mommy, look, I didn't drop them." He opened the box. Resting on the velvet cushion was the heavy turquoise ring, right next to a simple silver band. As I took Wyatt's calloused hand, I looked out over the land we had literally bled to save. The newly rebuilt stables, the rescue horses grazing peacefully, the family we had forged out of absolute devastating ashes. Our first wedding took exactly 10 seconds. It was fueled by pure, blinding spite. We signed a piece of paper just to prove a point to the people who broke us. This wedding. This one took 3 years of fire, massive debt, and tears to earn. We didn't just sign a contract this time. We built a fortress. I thought back to that desperate, heartbroken woman I was all those years ago. Standing in a county courthouse, shaking, humiliated, thinking my entire life was completely over. Many years from now, when I sit by the fire with Cody, I will probably still think about that afternoon. I will think about Judge Martha, with her tired eyes and her sharp, sarcastic voice. If she hadn't pushed her glasses down her nose and practically dared us, "Why don't you two just get hitched?" Then Wyatt and I would have just been 2 parallel lines. Ni 2 broken strangers walking right past each other in the absolute depths of our humiliation. Life is incredibly strange. Sometimes, the universe doesn't send a knight in shining armor to pull you out of the wreckage. Sometimes, the universe sends a grumpy, middle-aged county judge making a sarcastic joke just to snap you out of your nightmare. The strangers that cross our paths aren't accidents. They are perfectly placed gears, shifting the entire tracks of your destiny at the exact second you are about to drive off the cliff. Wyatt slipped the silver band onto my finger. He leaned in, his forehead resting gently against mine, his voice a low, steady whisper. "We made it, Clara. Yeah, we made it. So, if you are sitting somewhere right now, feeling completely betrayed, if you just lost your job, your partner, or you are crying alone on a cold plastic chair in some empty public building, please don't give up. Lift your head. Because sometimes the most absurd, devastating endings are just the brutal beginnings of something beautiful. It's not about where you start or how badly you fall. It is about who is standing right next to you in the ashes, willing to fight the whole world to pull you back up. You might just be one crazy, reckless decision away from the best thing that will ever happen to you.